Talent, effort and conviction are core recipes to success in the story of Haikyuu, at least individually, but almost none of it matters without conviction. To put effort into the craft of volleyball or any other sports, you need conviction, as well as the resolve to try. And effort is a necessity for both the talentless and talented to grow or attain their potential, a place among the best. We need look no further than our two main characters, Hinata and Kageyama, to see extreme examples of this. But there are a myriad of other more subtle character arcs that too are rewarded by these concepts. There are those with weak or latent conviction that don't put in the effort, but the conviction and love for the sport still exist nonetheless. Many characters often take for granted that they even have the necessary environment to convey their passion through effort, or even have the confidence and necessary conviction to be expressed in the first place. Haikyuu explores this briefly but importantly through Michimiya and Ikejiri, two that were surrounded by those who didn't believe in themselves nor cared very much for their training. The two became complacent and a product of their environment, with their passion diminished. But they did care. Their longing to emulate their friends Daiichi's inspiring leadership and efforts despite their insecurities proved so. However, one sudden burst of drive does not simply triumph against those who put in their effort since the beginning. This is the harsh reality of sports, resulting in their complete and utter failure in their final high school matches, learning from their mistakes far too late. The two leave the court with regret, unlikely to ever find the redemption to make up the lost opportunity of their high school career. But as much as their lack of talent and effort punished them, it was their expression of conviction that rewarded them in the end, with their final efforts painted in a positive, almost heroic light, leaving nothing left on the table, even if there wasn't much on there to begin with. As futile as it may seem, as much as their conviction paled to others, it was still worth voicing. Michimiya and Ikejiri chose to redeem what little they could, and I think it speaks volumes not only to their opponents and teammates, but themselves. It is never too late to try, even at the face of impossibility. From Daiichi to his two friends to their separate teammates, their conviction would bleed into each other and inspire the drive to win. As regretful and short-lived as these memories may seem, they were still memories of their team that came and fought together on the court for one collective cause, to win. A true sense of camaraderie that is worth remembering for the rest of their lives. And in the end, as much as it hurts that they couldn't find the self-fulfillment that they were looking for, maybe they can pass their support and will to someone else, to Daiichi, the man that inspired them in the first place, and see his journey to the top, a concession to move on from a dream that might have not been for them, but still was an aspiration that begged to be satiated nonetheless, even if it is fulfilled through someone else. Speaking of the captain of Karasuno, Daiichi had both effort and conviction from the get-go, but not the talent nor environment to see success. However, he'd take every defeat on the chin and keep moving forward, define and make his own opportunities. At the face of such demoralizing defeat in junior high, it seemed that he was the only one that cared, and the only one that refused to shy away even if it hurt him most in doing so. So he'd search for a new environment moving forward, where he would have an opportunity to thrive and grow through mutual determination in Karasuno High, the powerhouse of Miyagi. But the school's reputation had diminished incredibly by the time Daiichi set foot into the gym, with their famed coach and little giant gone. The glory days of Karasuno had passed, now bitterly known as the Fallen Champions. At this point, he felt trapped. It seemed that he was unable to move beyond his circumstances. But his conviction would not break, and it fueled his training to his maximum effort. If no one would guide him, he would seek it for himself. If no one stayed after practices, he would stay and train alone. If the team had no manager, he would take the initiative despite being a first year to find one. But despite all his efforts, they seemed to be in vain, and his first year of volleyball amounted to nothing. However, failure after failure, he still fought with no regrets. He'd continued to become a stronger pillar than ever before, both individually and as a leader figure, growing himself into one of the most balanced players of Karasuno, able to play competently in any position through much effort that would inspire everyone around him. Eventually, he'd become the captain, and even a temporary coach of the team, a fine leader that everyone would respect. After many crushing defeats, he still stood proudly, never letting go of his conviction, and his efforts would finally be rewarded in his third and final year, culminating in the strongest, most talented, passionate team yet. and this was largely due to his patient efforts to build his leadership, experience and initiative. It wasn't enough to patiently wait. He had to train himself and his team to be ready for anything, with or without an opportunity. He would build his name and reputation for 3 years, becoming a strong authority figure, and had the opportunity to create a competitive, disciplined environment for his team to thrive and carry their weight, both physically and mentally, unlike before where he seemed to be completely alone. And in the end, it would get him to the nationals. But not everyone with both effort and conviction can reap the reward of victory, at least not on the court. After all, at high levels of competition, those traits are a must. Akimiya is a tragic counterpart to Daichi, a man who likely loved the sport just as much, tried just as hard and was just as great of a leader, but was surrounded by those who didn't have mutual conviction nor work ethic. His team would suffer overwhelming defeat in his final year. He'd retire as a captain, never fulfilling his aspiration. However, his enthusiasm would continue to echo in the memories of the club. His teammates who deeply respected him for his unwavering conviction, efforts and leadership. And 1 year later, he was able to witness his legacy that was remembered in the spirit of his former teammates live on. As the former captain, I don't think he could have been more flattered and prouder. Though they may have been clumsy, he saw a healthy team with a bright future. His torch of optimism would continue to be passed on long after he left, feeling the catharsis of his volleyball journey outside of the court, thus leaving the sport with his head held high.
これはお前らの勝負だからどうしようとお前らの勝手だ。でも一個だけ言っとく。本気も必死も一生懸命もかっこ悪くない。
Now comes the best of the talentless, Oikawa, a magnificent setter, greatly rewarded by his perseverance and drive to be the best of his position. Unlike the others mentioned so far, he is by far the most impressive yet, and more than made up for his lack of talent through raw effort, surpassing even the finesse of Kageyama in multiple respects, a setter that is considered a genius even when compared to Oikawa. However, despite his skills, he resented the gifted, always feeling inferior and falling short in his own way to his junior setter and rival ace. Even when achieving victory, he only saw it as delaying the inevitable, where he'd eventually be surpassed. And it's this thinking and expectation that he puts on himself that unfortunately defines his destination, his career. His lack of conviction within himself stems from the belief of always being someone inferior to the talented, despite having every desire to be the best. His ambition would become misguided, blind to see what he could offer on the court until it was spelled out to him, that he needed to not overwork, had the resolve to keep improving and share the weight of burden with his team. After all, there are 6 players on one side of the court. So he became a setter that didn't just stand on his own, but blended seamlessly and brought out the best of every member on any possible team, something that his arch-nemesis Kageyama lacked. He perfected everything he could from this one lesson, understanding the habits and characteristics of his teammates, communicating and harmonizing with them to incredibly impressive degrees. However, as much as he grew, that would be as far as his efforts and conviction would take him. He was a setter that was limited to bringing out the best of his team but not better, a setter that was limited by effort and not talent, but most of all, he was a setter that was limited to see a way beyond, another perspective to grow. As much as he tried and believed in his team and to an extent himself, his insecurities wouldn't be overcome so easily, and he still deep down already accepted that he could never surpass the gifted, even when he stood among them as an overall player, or at least was close to. While a lot of his failings can be attributed to his environment, as an individual player, he never truly overcame his inferiority complex that hurt his conviction, at least until the very end, acknowledging that there will be a day where Kageyama will surpass him, thus eventually losing to the young but talented. It may have pushed him in the short term to maintain his superior ranking in the pecking order, however, his mindset would inherently detriment himself in the long term, falling short to someone who aimed and demanded higher of themselves. But I believe he realized this moments before the final match against Karasuna, refocusing and tempering his conviction regardless of a difference in talent. And as Hinata mentions, if it wasn't for the blocker, Oikawa would have successfully received the ball. Regardless of the newfound conviction, in that moment it was too little too late for the team. But despite the crushing defeat, he did not fall, refusing to look up to his rivals and facing them eye to eye for the first time. He may have lost the battle for now, but he'll be back.
俺は自分の選択が間違いだと思ったことはないし、俺のバレーは何一つ終わっていない。取るに足らないこのプライド、絶対に覚えておけよ。
A strange but possibly appropriate comparison to make to Okawa would be the protagonist himself, Hinata, a short and even less than talentless decoy. But despite being by skill and physique far inferior to Okawa and so many others, it is likely he'll grow into a far greater player than what we could have ever imagined, a prime example of one with nothing but conviction and effort. Call it luck for having a talented player on the team and having more opportunities to grow at the nationals, or call it a difference in mindset. I think both reasons are at play for why he'll go further. Ever since middle school, it was hammered into Hinata that volleyball wasn't the sport for him, that he would never see the view from the top. But he'd take and even create every opportunity he could, even the ones that weren't given to him, whether it be playing by himself, asking his friends desperately to join his empty team, practicing in the ladies' volleyball club, and asking anyone to toss to him just one more time. But it wasn't always as simple as trying harder. By the start of the series, we'd come to realize this. Like Okawa's lack of firm conviction and goals that sold himself short, effort too can hurt the growth of a player if misplaced, and this would serve as Hinata's biggest obstacle. He needed to prove to Kageyama and Karasuno his own worth by working together as an extension of the team where his true worth shined, and not individually. He needed to find his strength as a decoy and not the idealistic ace he dreamed of. He needed to know when to not back down from a fight with his teammate in order to find his own new weapon and not rely on someone else's, a shortcut of complacency that would eventually fail the team. And he needed to constantly find new perspectives to keep up with the talented and not become the reliant player so many saw him as, finding a voice of his own. The journey to find these answers wouldn't be so smooth either. He'd fail multiple times along the way. Among his greatest defining moments was Karasuno's loss against Albuquerque. In the past, Hinata's goal was to simply have a place on the court, and he was extremely grateful to finally achieve that. But that was a short-term goal of the boy he was yesterday, and it was his dream today to become the best. And that was impossible if he put so much of his burden on others, closing his eyes on them because he trusted them to carry it. At their game's matchpoint before Hinata could even open his eyes, Albuquerque had utterly shut down his killing quick, and he found his entire team behind him, scrambling desperately to try and save the ball, all before he could even react. He was the last to feel the burden of loss, and that infuriated him even more. Even if it might have been impossible to save the ball in his position, he still felt responsible to at least be there for his team, to carry his weight, a dilemma that was indicative of a bigger problem. His actions and reliance on the old quick in that moment reflected his past desires to stay on the court rather than someone that wanted to be the best. He felt the need to fight for the better of the team, and that meant improving himself to be able to carry his weight on his own, even if that meant risking his place on the court and starting feuds with the team. It is normal to fight, sometimes even necessary for your voice to be heard or changed, because every obstacle must be overcome, and there are no shortcuts to the top. Eventually, while the team temporarily worsened in the short term, it was a risk that was rewarded through Hinata's conviction within himself to always become better and eventually the best, that the team were able to see victory in the long term. In their rematch against Albuquerque during the match point, Karasuno had the golden opportunity to use their signature quick, and the sequence that followed was visually near identical to their last game's climax, the biggest difference being Hinata, spiking with intent, control, and most of all with his eyes open, seizing victory or loss with his own merits. And he completely broke through their defense, surpassing Albuquerque, and eventually even the powerhouse school, Shiratorizawa, thus making it to the nationals. But beyond the inter-high preliminaries, he'd find that it wasn't enough to improve by himself, nor to directly emulate his superiors. In many cases, it was outright impossible given his limitations. Hinata at every step of the way had to make concessions to incorporate other skills into his limited capabilities, twisting others' strengths to make it his very own. Understanding where to place his efforts to overcome his weaknesses, shortcomings, and mistakes in any scenario is core to his narrative. We'd see this especially when he fought so hard for an opportunity that wasn't given to him at the Shiratorizawa training camp, only to be relegated to a mere ball boy. But even if it was a waste of time in the eyes of so many others, Hinata would make this an opportunity to observe, analyze, and ultimately grow, making the most of something that once seemed worthless. Because just like on the court, in training, he had to jump, make a leap of faith, because he couldn't afford to pass up on opportunities to improve like so many others had the luxury to do so. From his lack of height, skills, talent and opportunities, he'd continue to defy and subvert expectations put on him, always surpassing his limitations and the person he was yesterday. If he was short, he'd jump higher. If the blockers towered him, he'd be faster and unpredictable. If he couldn't play, he'd observe and study. And yes, his conviction would waver at the face of the talented. He'd envy them honestly. But while he'd constantly make concessions of other skills to fit his own capabilities to grow, never once did he make concessions for his level of ambition, refusing to aim any lower than the best, even if it wasn't as an ace. And it's this quality that is recognized by Tsukishima of all people as talent worthy to be envious of. Against Aobuchisai, Shiratorizawa and plenty of other future teams, I'd like to believe that the presence of Hinata and his mindset would be the difference of loss and victory. After all, he wouldn't still be doing volleyball if his conviction broke all those years back. This is the difference between Okawa and Hinata. Defying Hinata's physical limitations and others' expectations is all he does, which in the end rewards him, a contrast to Okawa, who lets both factors define him. Despite all his efforts and resolve, he was punished for his lack of conviction within himself. Now, I'm not saying that the talentless can always become better than the talented, that will always be an uphill battle, but I'm saying that there's always a way to better oneself and offer something more that nobody else can. The only thing preventing growth in these cases are insecurities that hurt conviction and misplaced effort that lead one to plateau. Overcoming every personal small and major battle, taking opportunities others have missed, and trusting your efforts will make all the difference, talented or talentless, because you can always fly higher.
コンクリート出身、日向翔陽です。あなたをぶっ倒して全国へ行きます。
Among the gifted we have Tsukishima, one that has exceptional game sense and height, especially for his age. But unlike so many others who dreamed of having the natural talents he does, he was envious of the hardworking and motivated, unable to find the conviction to grow and temper the tools right in front of him. And unlike many of those who similarly have talent for volleyball, he did not have the luxury or opportunity, at least for a long time, to enjoy what he was talented at. He was a person who fell out of love for volleyball, or rather, one that never truly knew how to love it before resenting and even fearing it. His love and later bitterness for the sport were always tied directly to his brother, the hero that brought him onto the court by admiration, only to have it utterly betrayed. But rather than seeing it as deceit, he saw it as the hard work of the person he looked up to amounted to nothing but pain, with no place on the court or even on the bench. So despite his talents, he'd repress his love for the sport, playing off his insecurities with an arrogant, lazy and provoking persona, never doing more than what was necessary so his efforts wouldn't betray him. What good would his best do if the efforts of the one he looked up to were worthless? He never saw himself for what he truly was, one that had far more potential than the one he aspired to be, a failure to recognize and pursue one's strength. And watching those around him, especially Hinata, someone that mirrored the little giant who was the ace of his brother's team, work so vigorously to have a place on the court, would only show further contrast in his lack of conviction and effort, that he simply didn't have it in him to try. And this sense of pointlessness to try would only be further proven by those around him, his team, when they all worked so hard but still lost so tragically against Aobuchisai, so early and far from the nationals. But despite all his anxieties of the sport, he still played volleyball, and so did many others. Because in reality, he already had his own perspective, experience and interest for the sport outside of his brothers that he simply refused to acknowledge, yet couldn't find it in himself to abandon. His outward behaviour, while fooling most for an extended period, would eventually show cracks and contradictions however, and his insecurities would be called into question by those such as Kuro, that he'd be surpassed by Hinata, and he'd be right if Tsukishima continued to stand still and not train. But Tsukishima never saw it that way, quite the opposite. When so many others belittled Hinata for his lack of overall skill and individuality on the court, Tsukishima felt threatened and inferior to his teammates' hard work and conviction, something he'd call talent than what they truly were. This was a dismissal of his own capabilities as an excuse not to try, believing he'd never surpass someone like Hinata because of a difference in talent which was well out of control, when in reality, he had none. Everything Hinata could do as an individual player, Tsukishima was easily capable of doing better, at least when it came to skill and game sense. But because he didn't believe in himself nor put in the effort, his talents would not shine, and felt that he fell short when so many others saw him as the better player. His first major step in the series would be when he was confronted by Yamaguchi, his best friend. Yamaguchi was someone who always struggled to find a voice both on a team and in a social environment due to being bullied in childhood. He was always reliant on others, hiding behind Tsukishima, who, when mocking others, he would join in, hiding his own insecurities. But on the court, you have no one to hide behind. There are 6 players on the team who all need to carry their weight, otherwise they'd be easy targets to be exploited. He would curse his ineptitude, being the only first year unable to become a regular of the team, struggling to follow Tsukishima, who was well out of reach. All he could do was seemingly support those around him while he stood still. But despite his lack of worth, there was still something he could offer that nobody else could, as the show keeps reiterating, this being his float serve that he'd go out of his way to learn from Shimada. For once, he did something on his own, for himself, and while he'd be met with immediate, crushing failure on his very first step, he could not abandon his hard work nor the team after they had shown so much support towards him, something he had always wanted. And he'd practice constantly by himself, perfecting the one weapon he had, his spear. But to someone like Tsukishima, it all seemed pointless, because logically speaking there will always be someone better, and what was the point in trying if you couldn't be number 1, if you tried only to eventually lose? And while Tsukishima spoke and acted for mostly himself, this was an indirect spit to the face for Yamaguchi and everything he represented, he who tries so much harder just to have a few moments on the court. And he could not back down from this fight even if it seemed out of character, because none of that matters. What matters is pride.
そんなもんプライド以外に何がいるんだ
For the first time, Yamaguchi stepped out of Tsukishima's shadow and had the conviction to stand up for his ideologies, a unique expression of conviction that stemmed from beyond volleyball, and he was rewarded not only on the court but through gaining his best friend's recognition and respect after all these years. And Tsukishima finally understood the answer that was right in front of him, that everyone in Karasuno and even himself exhibited, because in truth, he did have pride for his craft, and he'd be egged on in multiple instances when others mocked him, even if he didn't bother to defend himself most of the time or played it off. And that's what keeps him and everyone else playing, to pride in your hard work, your team, and the sports itself. At the end of the day, winning and losing are destinations, not the journey. But while he now understood pride, he did not understand what was most important: passion, the thrill of volleyball, something that kept others coming back with such determination beyond success, failure, pride, and just being good at the sport. It was a sense of obsession that he could see but couldn't understand. But since being moved by Yamaguchi, he would genuinely try for the first time on the court to find an answer, which came in the form of approaching Bokuto and Guro, and it was Bokuto that gave him an answer, an unlikely friend but was one of the few players that understood his apathy. And this apathy could only be overcome by that one moment, by a hook that would bring out everything you had to win against your opponent triumphantly. But while it was a feeling that made sense by words, it was still a foreign idea, and after years of suppressing himself, this wouldn't be so easy to achieve. One game after another, he consistently performed well and slowly broke out of his shell. While he once played either casually or to taunt his opponents, he now took it seriously, doing everything he could as the middle blocker of the team to shut down his adversary and ultimately win. His physical and especially reading capabilities would be pushed, even going as far to communicate with all his team, even with those he'd normally butt heads with. He was playing the best he ever had. However, he'd eventually hit his first wall against Shiro Torizawa, where even his game sense and efforts could not stand up to Ushijima, the first significant player to directly oppose him. It seemed almost impossible to do anything given his training. But ironically, despite Tsukishima's previous absence of conviction and current lack of self-worth, it took the best player in the Miyagi prefecture to bring out Tsukishima's best and talents. Spike after spike, he continued to challenge the greatest ace the team had ever faced, fueled by pride and the resolve to keep trying. Despite being unable to send back the ace's spikes, he was able to get an impressive number of one-touches slowly but surely, but he hungered for more. And that one defining moment that would hook him into the sports of volleyball that he'd been searching for finally came, successfully performing a kill block against all odds, shutting down the famed ace. At that moment, as much as he knew that it was just a club, that it was just one successful block out of many, for the first time in his volleyball career, he felt the true catharsis of the sport, unable to contain his triumphant roar. He finally felt passion and pride for himself, seeing his talents bloom rather than have it go to waste after much effort, and as a viewer, it was satisfying to say the least. While Tsukishima still has many flaws as a player, still unable to acknowledge that he has talents, nor does he have much conviction within himself, it seems that the first step for Tsukishima is effort, rather than conviction like Daichi and Hinata, because these traits go hand in hand. His training will only further grow his talents, and I believe when he finally recognizes it, he will at last have the conviction he went his whole volleyball career without, earning it through achievement. Despite being the MVP of Karasuno's match against Shiratorizawa, he still lacked a sense of victory, because he doesn't believe in his skills. But now that he's made the first step, he's not only needed on the court, but he also belongs there, and when stripped away for even a single set, what once would have been freedom for him to take a break is now a prison from his passion. It's clear that his arc, much like Hinata, Kageyama and many others, are still not complete, and I look forward to how far he'll go at the Nationals.
どうも普通の方です一人時間さうちの野生児は騙せても僕には通じないんでよろしくどうぞ
Ushijima, the captain of the powerhouse Shiratorizawa Academy, as well as one of Japan's top 3 aces, is undoubtedly the most threatening player yet. From his height, power, stamina, he is the embodiment of raw gifted strength every volleyball player would dream of, a complete dichotomy to someone like Hinata. In the eyes of head coach Washijo, Ushijima is the model player that he can never be in his youth, and he'd build a team surrounding Ushijima's qualities. But while the coach may have had the ideal ace, he did not have the ideal team as we'd see in their match against Karasuno, the battle of concepts. Just as conviction and effort can stagnate or hurt one's growth if viewed incorrectly, talent too is a double-edged sword, even more so than the others. The team of Shiratorizawa would fully utilize Ushijima's talents to a fault. Everything each player did on the team in training and matches was to be like Ushijima, or was to support him. If anyone ever made a play that excluded Ushijima, it was in service to defending and preserving the stamina of their ace. Tendo would guest block and be Ushijima's shield. Shirabu would be the setter that would stand out the least for his ace to shine, and Goshiki would spike for Ushijima when he needed rest or a diversion. When they'd sub out other players, it would be simply to replenish the tools around Ushijima, unlike Karasuno who subbed out players for a new strategy and perspective. Individually, each player was certainly stronger than the ones of Karasuno, but together, they'd lose. There are multiple visual motifs of a single white eagle battling against 6 crows that would symbolically portray the difference in teamwork and strengths. In training, strategy and games, Ushijima, and by extension the coach and team, were rigid, predictable, simplistic and safe, directly contrasting to Karasuno, who didn't have such dominating players and had to be flexible, unpredictable, complex and risky to stand a chance. They would share the burden, communicate, strategize together with the coach and so on. It was a two-way road rather than one. The ideologies of both teams would take each of them far. However, in the clash between the two, as much resolve and conviction as Ushijima had to carry all the weight, in the end, the burden was too heavy, thus losing to the underdog team. Individually, while he made the most of his talents, he did nothing more, lacking the variety that would have made him unpredictable and flexible with his team. The ace, the coach, and Shiratorizawa relied too much on his talents and refused to open up to new approaches for other players, when many of them had the skills and assets that clearly could shine in their own way. But they were never pushed to try new methods as, unfortunately, that was incompatible with the coach's values. But these values were inferior to Karasuno's, as to his frustration, they proved that the strength of a volleyball team wasn't just talent, something he was never able to accept, as he never found that perspective for himself in his volleyball career, giving up and blaming his failures on his circumstances. Ushijima and Shiratorizawa are reflections of the coach's incapabilities and what he failed against, while Hinata and Karasuno are reflections of what his capabilities were and what he failed to be.
まるで小さな
大きいものが強い。それが自然の摂理だわ。
Kageyama, once referred to as the king of the court, is a genius among setters, an all-round fantastic player, one that had conviction, effort and talent from the get-go. He can make each player, no, his entire team, even better. But the gifted have their own unique struggles, pressure and expectations to live up to. And it's here where we'd see the worst of what talents can do to a player, or more accurately, what a player can do to their talents, because it's a far lonelier battle at the top. In middle school to his early career in Karasuno, he was an impressive player with an ego that was through the roof, hence his king title. Although it was backed by genuine skill, those toxic traits would disregard everyone but himself and had no place on the team. He'd make perfect yet impossible tosses that demanded more than what his team were, which contradicted with his support role on the court, the one that was meant to pave the way for others, for victory. But instead, in his quest for self-perfection, he paved the way to failure. His sets would only be for the best, those that were necessary for victory. But those were worthless tosses because his entire team should have been necessary. In the end, he'd be abandoned for using his talents for himself and not for his team. Luckily for him, Daiichi was the captain of his high school volleyball team and recognized Kageyama's danger to the team. So a trial was set in place between the first years that incentivized teamwork, where if Kageyama lost, he would have no place being the team's setter. With such high stakes as well as his desires to move past his regret and Tsuga's input, for the first time he used his talents for someone else. Thus both he and Hinata finally found a place on the court. Instead of making the best possible sets, he would make the best possible sets for Hinata, ones that would perfectly bridge the gap between his insurmountable skill and one with none. If Hinata couldn't hit the ball, Kageyama would send it straight to his hands, even if the spiker's eyes were closed. He'd become the perfect setter for his team as it exists today. However, while he certainly evolved from his past failures, the lesson he took away from his past was a shortcut and incomplete, which in itself proved to be dangerous in the long run, and he found himself unable to move beyond his king title. During the Tokyo training camp after Karasuno's defeat, it was made clear that the team had become too reliant on the original quick strike, and it was useless to merely improve it, especially at higher levels of volleyball, where people would be able to read the attack like a book. So Hinata needed to find his own new weapon. However, Kageyama disagreed, believing that Hinata could not carry the weight of doing a quick with his eyes open and with his own control. Kageyama could and would continue bridging the gap between himself and Hinata, and any efforts to tip the scale seemed unnecessary, because he could carry the team, but that was the problem. Hinata and Karasuno would fully believe in Kageyama's tosses, but Kageyama didn't fully believe in his team. As someone who once stood at the top by himself, he now stood below everyone else and carried the burden of others, doing so much on his own even when it was unwarranted. He simply did it out of selflessness, out of fear of his old selfish self, eventually hitting the limit of what he could do. After all, he was one man of 6 on the court. Once again, his gift became a curse that held his team back, much like Ushijima's talents that were over-relied upon. But he could not let his flaws stop him from moving forward. After all, he had the conviction to surpass Okawa, as well as worth ethic and focus like no other. In his desperate search, he'd find himself before his senior rival. Swallowing his pride and embarrassment, he resolved himself to finding the errors of his ways, even going as far as to give chase and bow to Okawa, the man he lost to, for an answer. And Okawa would cave in, highlighting his biggest flaw. While Kageyama gave great sets to Hinata, they weren't the exact sets he wanted. And his refusal to open up to his teammates' requests because he thought he knew what was best for them meant that he was no different to the oppressive king he was in junior high, because it was the spiker that rightfully has leadership in the attack. That was the difference between the two setters. Kageyama would finally concede, achieving his answer by making a far greater effort to communicate and obtain feedback, trusting his team and learning the skills needed to optimize everyone around him to their liking. But unlike Okawa, who was charismatic, he was antisocial, but that didn't stop him from trying and improving. And Karasuno would finally evolve again after taking a risk with Hinata, achieving victory against Alba Josai. While he still falls short in multiple respects to his senior rival, he certainly could hold his own and even surpass him in other ways, making it to the nationals. His skills would further be recognized on top of it, invited to Japan's National Youth Training Camp, where all the best of the country would gather. But it was here among the best where more than ever before he felt confronted for who he was. Mia would be the catalyst for this, being a fellow talented setter that closely observed Kageyama's plays and how he carried himself. And it seems that Mia recognized Kageyama's skills as a potential threat of the future, even going out of his way to provoke doubt in him, to be an ace instead, that he was a goody two-shoes, with the latter being effective. Once again, Kageyama butting heads with another setter that saw right through him, put him in another introspective crisis. He had come so far from the inconsiderate, arrogant and selfish player he was yesterday, and worked so hard to be a team player like Okawa, yet here he was being called out for being who he was today. And this doubt would bleed into his training, even when he returned home to his team. After playing and setting for such talented players, and being pushed so hard in training against Deep Tech, the flaws of his teammates were magnified, frustratingly so. He trusted and believed in his talents and skills, everyone did, and to see the fruits of his efforts fail because of those around him was aggravating. He'd tried to hold back his oppressive nature from so long ago, but reached his breaking point.
俺はいいトス上げてます。もっと決めてください。
The king had returned. He was always there, because at heart that's who he is. But unlike his old team in junior high, he had made a genuine effort to use his talents selflessly in Karasuno. He had shared sweat, tears and triumph with them, and every single person had earned respect to their name. And it was quickly made clear that no one would allow themselves to be trampled by Kageyama, but nor would they abandon him. Nobody embodied this more than Hinata, the one that butt heads with him yet understood him most. Instead of not being a king, he should aim to be a good one. Kageyama took his lessons and mistakes from his old team and Oikawa a step too far after being scarred so badly, suppressing his voice, thus making the lessons he learnt incomplete. While he suddenly evolved and became a better player, he became submissive. Feedback was a one-way road directed to the setter alone, and he'd make perfect sets to every player as they are today, adjusting to all their bad habits, rather than incentivizing improvement for the better of tomorrow. And while Coach Ukai has always said that the best sets are the ones that the spiker can easily hit, that doesn't mean that a setter and spiker can't challenge more of each other for a stronger attack. Kageyama already does this with Hinata due to the nature of their relationship, though not with the rest of the team out of consideration. However, that would limit their individual growth, because at the end of the day, a king doesn't have to have negative connotations if he serves his people right. With such power and weight on his shoulders, Kageyama's arc as a player stems down to the difficulties of how he can best utilize his talents for the better of the team, with every misstep he makes being detrimental. Like what one of the coaches from the All Japan training camp said, geniuses are the furthest from perfection.
俺がいればお前は最強だ。
Talent, effort and conviction are consistent mechanics in the story of Haikyuu, explored in compelling ways time and time again. We're all limited in one way or another and to different degrees, whether it be by perspective, expectation or talents. No one is born equal, but nor completely helpless. Everyone has their own unique battles and something to offer. The strength of our conviction, where we place our effort, and how we use our talents are everything. Whether or not we can prevail from our circumstances is up to us. That's what makes sports worth watching and experiencing. Merely 4 seasons in, there's been such a diverse cast of great characters that are memorably written for their triumph or defeat through these concepts. It's a sports shonen series with a heart of gold, and I think there's something everyone can take away from this anime manga series. Personally, I'm looking forward to the future of the Haikyuu anime. I've been really enjoying the build up to the nationals. I can't wait to see future developments of our current cast, as well as ones that have already been set up. For now, I'll put a bookmark on this video and hope to come back and talk about new and compelling characters that I'm sure will come. Thank you all for watching this video. It's certainly a long one, especially to me. I hope you all enjoyed it. Till next time, I'll see you later with more to come.
観覧の旅路も夢叶うまで
頂の景色。俺一人では決して見ることのできない景色。でも一人ではないのなら